The engineer's burden. The workshop fell silent, except for the rhythmic hammering of metal against metal. Klaus Weber, a 34-year-old mechanical engineer at Rheinmetall, stared at the disassembled MG42 spread across his workbench like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast. It was 1959, 14 years after Germany's surrender, and the Federal Republic needed weapons again. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being asked to resurrect the very machine gun that had terrorized Allied forces during the war, the weapon his own countrymen had called Hitler's buzzsaw. But Weber saw something else entirely, a chance to transform a symbol of destruction into an instrument of protection for a new Germany. The cold February wind rattled the windows of the Düsseldorf facility, carrying with it the scent of industrial coal smoke that had become familiar across the rebuilding Rhineland. Weber's hands moved with practiced precision over the weapon's components, each piece triggering memories he'd spent years trying to forget. The roller-delayed blowback system, the quick-change barrel, the feeding mechanism, all of it as familiar as his own reflection, and just as haunting. Herr Weber, the NATO specifications have arrived. The voice belonged to Heinrich Müller, a junior engineer who'd been assigned to the project. The young man's eagerness reminded Weber of himself 15 years earlier, when innovation seemed like salvation rather than damnation. Weber accepted the thick manila folder without looking up. The strategic crisis facing the newly formed Bundeswehr was stark, and everyone knew it. NATO demanded standardization around the 7.62 Ksiski 50mm NATO cartridge, but Germany's military-industrial base lay in ruins. American M60 machine guns were available, but German military doctrine emphasized different tactical principles: rapid deployment, sustained fire, and mechanical reliability under extreme conditions. The MG42's design philosophy remained sound, but its 7.922 57mm Mauser cartridge was obsolete. "Someone has to bridge the gap between past innovation and present necessity," Weber murmured, more to himself than to Müller. The afternoon light streaming through the workshop windows caught the metal surfaces of the disassembled weapon, creating patterns of reflection and shadow that seemed to dance across the workbench. Weber had grown up in a Bavarian village where his father repaired farm equipment with nothing but scrap metal and ingenuity. During the war, as a teenage apprentice at a small arms factory, he'd witnessed the MG42's birth, a weapon born from Germany's desperate need for rapid production and devastating firepower. He remembered the pride in the eyes of its creator, Werner Gruner, who believed he was building a tool to protect German soldiers. Weber also remembered the horror in those same eyes when reports came back from the Eastern Front about what his creation was doing to human beings. The machine gun's rate of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute at its peak, had earned it a reputation that transcended tactical effectiveness and entered the realm of psychological warfare. "Herr Weber?" Müller's voice carried a note of concern. "Are you all right?" Weber looked up, realizing he'd been gripping the weapon's bolt assembly so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He set it down carefully, as if it were made of glass rather than hardened steel. "Just remembering," he said quietly. After the war, Weber had worked in civilian manufacturing, rebuilding Bavaria's industrial base. Tractors, generators, industrial machinery, anything that didn't kill. But the memories haunted him, not just of the weapon's destructive power, but of the engineering brilliance that created it. The MG42's revolutionary roller-delayed blowback system, its quick-change barrel, its incredible rate of fire, these represented genuine innovations that transcended their original purpose. When the Bundeswehr contract arrived in 1958, Weber saw an opportunity for redemption, both personal and national. But now, holding the weapon's components in his hands again, he wondered if redemption was truly possible, or if he was simply creating new instruments of death with a cleaner conscience. The workshop door opened, and Colonel Hans Dietrich entered, followed by two American military advisors whose names Weber had already forgotten. Their presence filled the room with tension, as thick as the coal smoke outside. "Gentlemen," Dietrich announced, "let me introduce Klaus Weber, our lead engineer on the NATO standardization project." One of the Americans, a tall man with graying temples, stepped forward. "Mr. Weber, I have to ask, why does Germany need its own machine gun at all? The M60 meets all specifications and is already in production." Weber felt the weight of history in that question. It wasn't really about specifications or production schedules. It was about trust, about whether the new Germany could be trusted with weapons of its own design, about whether the sins of the past could ever be truly absolved. "Because, Colonel," Weber said slowly, "sometimes the only way to transform something evil is to rebuild it from the inside out." The American's expression remained skeptical, but Weber caught a flicker of something else, curiosity perhaps, or recognition of the moral complexity they all carried. As evening fell over Düsseldorf, Weber remained alone in the workshop, surrounded by the scattered components of a weapon that had changed the course of history. Outside, the sounds of the city's reconstruction continued. Hammers and saws, truck engines and workers' voices, all the noise of a nation trying to rebuild itself. But in the quiet of the workshop, with only the distant hum of factory machinery for company, Weber could hear something else. The echo of his own young voice years ago, when he'd first seen the MG42's test firing and whispered to Gruner that they'd created something magnificent. Now he wondered if magnificence and monstrosity could ever be truly separated, or if the engineer's burden was to carry both forever. If stories like this make you question what you do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. How does a man rebuild something that once broke him? The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. As winter gave way to spring in 1959, Weber found himself working 16-hour days in Rheinmetall's Düsseldorf facility, surrounded by blueprints that looked more like archaeological excavations than engineering documents. The NATO cartridge generated different pressures and required modified feeding mechanisms. Military bureaucrats wanted a completely new weapon, while cost-conscious politicians demanded something cheap and quick. Weber's proposal to modernize the MG42 faced skepticism from all sides. American military advisors questioned why Germany needed its own machine gun at all. German generals, eager to distance themselves from Nazi-era weapons, preferred foreign alternatives. Even his own engineering team seemed divided between those who saw the project as necessary progress and those who viewed it as an unwelcome resurrection of the past. "Klaus, you're killing yourself over this," said Dr. Friedrich Langs, the facility's senior metallurgist. They'd known each other since before the war, when both were young engineers full of ambition and certainty. Now Langs's hair had gone completely grey, and his eyes carried the weight of too many compromises. Maybe it's time to let the Americans handle defense contracts, but Weber couldn't let it go. Each morning, he arrived at the workshop before dawn. The scent of fresh coffee from the factory cafeteria mixing with the smell of machine oil and metal shavings that permeated the building. The Rhineland air still carried traces of coal smoke from the region's industrial revival, a constant reminder of Germany's determination to rebuild itself from the ashes. The original MG42's 7.92mm chamber needed to be rebored to accept NATO ammunition. The bolt system required subtle modifications to handle different cartridge dimensions. The feeding mechanism needed adjustment for NATO's standard belts. Each change created ripple effects throughout the weapon's intricate mechanical symphony, requiring Weber to reconsider assumptions that had been taken for granted for 15 years. In quiet moments, usually late at night when the factory fell silent around him, Weber found himself thinking about Werner Gruner. His old mentor had died in 1951, just 6 years after the war's end, but not before sharing with Weber the burden of knowing exactly what their creation had accomplished. Gruner had kept newspaper clippings, military reports, testimonies from prisoners of war, all documenting the MG42's effectiveness and its terror. It was never supposed to be about the fear, Gruner had told him during their last conversation. We wanted to protect our boys by ending fights quickly. But somewhere between the drawing board and the battlefield, our intention got lost. Now Weber faced the same moral maze his mentor had navigated. Was it possible to take the engineering brilliance of the MG42 and strip away its capacity for creating terror? Could intention alone transform a weapon's moral weight? The first breakthrough came in April, when Weber realized the solution wasn't to fight the NATO cartridge's different characteristics, but to embrace them. The 7.62 51mm NATO round was actually less powerful than the original 7.92 key 57mm Mauser, which meant he could modify the weapon's rate of fire more precisely. Instead of the original's devastating 1,200 rounds per minute, he could create something more controllable, between 700 and 1,300 rounds per minute, depending on the tactical situation. Herr Weber, called Müller from across the workshop. The test components are ready. Weber walked over to examine the modified bolt assembly. The changes were subtle. A few millimeters here, a different spring tension there, but they represented months of calculation and recalculation. In his hands, the metal felt warm from the machining process, almost alive. The workshop had become his world. Maps of Europe covered one wall, showing NATO deployments and Soviet positions across the divided continent. The Cold War had given Germany's rearmament a new context, no longer the aggressor nation seeking conquest, but a frontline ally defending democratic values against communist expansion. It was a narrative that made the work easier to justify, though Weber wondered how much of that justification was genuine and how much was convenient self-deception. Colonel Dietrich visited regularly, usually accompanied by different American or British observers. Their questions had evolved from skepticism about German weapons to curiosity about German engineering. Weber had begun to sense that the real test wasn't whether his modified weapon would work, but whether Germany could be trusted to create instruments of alliance rather than conquest. "Tell me, Mr. Weber," asked a British major during one such visit, "how do you ensure this weapon won't end up in the wrong hands?" It was a question Weber had been asking himself for months. The MG42 had been copied, modified and manufactured by dozens of countries during and after the war. Some had ended up defending democracy. Others had been used to suppress it. The engineer's burden was that innovation, once released, belonged to the world, not to its creator. "Major," Weber replied carefully, "we can only control the intention with which we create something. What happens afterward? That's up to the people who inherit our work." As spring deepened into early summer, Weber began to see the shape of what the weapon might become. Not the MG42, with all its historical baggage, but something new, the MG3 perhaps. A weapon designed not for blitzkrieg or territorial conquest, but for defensive positions and allied cooperation. The irony wasn't lost on him that Germany, the nation that had once sought to dominate Europe, was now creating weapons specifically designed to protect it. But irony, Weber had learned, was often history's way of offering second chances to those brave enough to recognize them. Late one evening, as the workshop settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, Weber found himself holding a photograph that Gruner had given him years earlier. It showed a young German soldier, no more than 19, manning an MG42 position somewhere on the Eastern Front. The boy's eyes held a mixture of pride and terror that Weber recognized from his own mirror during those dark years. He wondered what that soldier would think of the weapon Weber was creating now, whether he would see betrayal or redemption in the transformation of Hitler's buzzsaw into NATO's defender, Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new calculations, new attempts to balance the mathematics of engineering with the algebra of human conscience. But tonight, surrounded by the tools and blueprints of his trade, Weber allowed himself to hope that redemption might be more than just an engineer's dream. Can engineering brilliance ever be separated from its moral consequences? By late May 1959, the Düsseldorf workshop had taken on the atmosphere of a laboratory where moral philosophy met mechanical precision. Weber meticulously redesigned the weapon's internal mechanisms, each modification requiring him to balance NATO specifications against the accumulated wisdom of German small arms engineering. The Rhineland summer brought longer days, and Weber found himself working by natural light well into the evening, the western windows of the facility casting long shadows across his workbench. The letters from home had started arriving more frequently. His wife, Maria, wrote from their small house in Bavaria. Her words carefully measured as always. She never asked directly about the weapon he was building, but her concern seeped through every line. "Klaus," she wrote in her most recent letter, "Father Möller mentioned you in his sermon last Sunday. He spoke about redemption and second chances, about how God sometimes asks us to rebuild what we once helped destroy. I thought you should know that the village hasn't forgotten what you're trying to do." Weber folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, next to a dozen others that said similar things in different ways. The Bavarian village where he'd grown up had lost 37 men in the war, including 2 of his childhood friends. That his current work might help prevent similar losses in the future was a thought that both comforted and haunted him. The moral weight of the project had begun affecting his team differently. Müller, the young engineer, approached each day with enthusiasm that sometimes bordered on naive excitement. For him, the MG3 represented pure innovation, divorced from the historical baggage of its predecessor. Dr. Langs, by contrast, had grown increasingly quiet as the work progressed. His comments, limited to technical observations, delivered in a tone that suggested profound ambivalence. "Friedrich," Weber said one afternoon, finding Langs staring at a cross-section diagram of the modified feeding mechanism, "what's troubling you?" Langs was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the blueprint's lines. "I keep thinking about Werner," he finally said. How excited he was when the MG42 first worked, how certain he was that he was saving German lives. Weber nodded, understanding the subtext. Every engineer carried the weight of unintended consequences, but weapons designers carried it more heavily than most. The distance between noble intention and horrific application was measured not in miles, but in the space between a drawing board and a battlefield. The first test firing was scheduled for March 1959, but technical problems had delayed it repeatedly. The modified bolt system struggled with the different cartridge dimensions, jamming after only a few rounds. Weber had anticipated this. Innovation required patience and persistence, not just brilliant inspiration. But each failure brought fresh criticism from military observers and political overseers. "Mr. Weber," said Colonel Dietrich during one particularly tense meeting, "the Americans are beginning to question whether German engineering is up to modern standards. Perhaps it's time to consider alternative approaches." The suggestion stung, not because Weber doubted his abilities, but because it highlighted the broader question of German competence in the post-war world. The nation that had once led the world in engineering innovation was now being asked to prove it could keep pace with Allied technological development. But Weber had learned from Gruner's experience that breakthrough moments often came after apparent failures. 3 months after the disappointing initial test, during a sweltering summer trial at a Bavarian proving ground not far from Weber's home village, the redesigned weapon performed flawlessly. The sound was different from the original MG42, more controlled, less like the buzz saw that had given the weapon its nickname, and more like precise industrial machinery. The rate of fire, controllable between 700 and 1300 rounds per minute, provided tactical flexibility unknown in contemporary designs. The quick-change barrel system remained intact, allowing sustained fire operations impossible with other weapons. "Gentlemen," announced the American test observer, a colonel named Patterson, whom Weber had come to respect. "This weapon meets all NATO specifications and exceeds most of them," but Weber's satisfaction was complicated by the realization that he had succeeded in creating something potentially as devastating as what he was trying to replace. The true innovation wasn't technical, it was philosophical. He had transformed a weapon designed for aggressive warfare into one optimized for defensive operations. The MG3's modifications emphasized accuracy over raw firepower, sustainability over shock effect. Where the MG42 was designed to break enemy attacks through overwhelming violence, the MG3 was built to hold positions and protect allies. That evening, as the test team celebrated at a small gasthouse near the proving ground, Weber found himself in conversation with Patterson. The American had served in the Pacific during the war and understood the moral complexity of weapons development in ways that surprised Weber. "You know, Klaus," Patterson said, using Weber's first name for the first time, "I've been thinking about what you said that first day in Düsseldorf, about transforming evil from the inside out." Weber nodded, waiting. "I think you've done something harder than that," Patterson continued. "You've taken something that represented one country's ambition to dominate and turned it into an instrument of collective defense. That's not transformation. That's transmutation." The word stayed with Weber as he returned to Düsseldorf the next day. Transmutation suggested a fundamental change in essence, not just form. It implied that the MG3 might truly be something different from its predecessor, despite sharing so much of its mechanical DNA. But transmutation also suggested something alchemical, almost mystical, and Weber was too much of an engineer to believe in magic. What he had accomplished was the result of calculation, testing, and careful attention to the relationship between intention and execution. If there was anything mystical about it, it was only in the way that human conscience could impose itself on mechanical design. As summer deepened and the MG3 moved closer to production approval, Weber began receiving reports about international interest in the weapon. Countries across Europe and beyond were inquiring about licensing agreements. The irony was profound. A weapon designed by German engineers to defend against German aggression was now being sought by nations around the world for their own defense. The letters from Maria had grown warmer as news of the project's success reached their village. "Father Müller says you found a way to turn swords into plowshares," she wrote. "I'm not sure I understand all the details, but I know you found something like peace with the past. Peace with the past." Weber wished it were that simple. Each day in the workshop brought reminders that the MG3, however morally refined its purpose, was still an instrument designed to take human life. The transmutation Patterson had spoken of was real, but it was incomplete. The engineer's burden remained. The knowledge that creation and destruction were often indistinguishable until history provided context. Late one night, working alone in the workshop while Düsseldorf slept around him, Weber found himself thinking about the young soldier in Gruner's photograph. Would that boy, who had manned an MG42 position with such a mixture of pride and terror, understand what Weber was trying to accomplish? Would he see the MG3 as redemption or betrayal? The answer, Weber realized, would depend not on the weapon itself, but on the hands that held it and the cause it served. That uncertainty was perhaps the most honest relationship an engineer could have with his creation, to hope for nobility while preparing for the possibility of its absence. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. How many times can a man rebuild the same machine before he rebuilds himself? The autumn of 1959 brought a different rhythm to the Rheinmetall facility. The MG3, as it had officially been designated, was moving through final production preparations. But Weber found himself grappling with questions that went far beyond technical specifications. The weapon's success had attracted attention from NATO headquarters and defense ministries across the Western Alliance, but it had also attracted scrutiny from unexpected quarters. Dr. Elizabeth Hoffmann arrived on a grey October morning, introduced simply as a researcher from the University of Munich's Institute for Contemporary History. She was younger than Weber had expected, perhaps 35, with the kind of intensity that suggested she'd spent too many hours in archives and not enough in sunlight. "Mr. Weber," she said, settling into the small conference room that Colonel Dietrich had arranged for their meeting, "I'm conducting research on the moral dimensions of weapons development in post-war Germany. I'd like to understand how engineers like yourself process the historical weight of your work." Weber had been dreading this conversation for months. He'd known that eventually someone would come asking the deeper questions, not about barrel tolerances or firing rates, but about conscience and complicity. "Dr. Hoffmann," he replied carefully, "I'm not sure I'm qualified to speak about moral dimensions. I'm an engineer. I solve mechanical problems." She smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. "With respect, Mr. Weber, mechanical problems don't exist in a vacuum. The MG42 was a mechanical solution to a military problem, but it became something much larger. I'm interested in how you've approached that legacy." Through the conference room windows, Weber could see the workshop where he'd spent the past year rebuilding history. The afternoon shift was changing over, and workers moved past with the easy familiarity of people who'd found their place in the world's reconstruction. "The MG42 was designed to protect German soldiers," Weber said finally. "The men who created it believed they were serving their country's defense. The fact that it was used for other purposes, that's the difference between intention and application." Dr. Hoffmann opened a manila folder and spread several photographs across the table. Weber recognized some of them. They were from Gruner's collection, images of the MG42 in various theaters of war. But others were new to him. Soldiers from different armies, different conflicts, all connected by the distinctive silhouette of the weapon he'd helped perfect 15 years earlier. "These photographs span from 1943 to 1958, she said. 15 years of the MG42's operational history. German troops, yes, but also Yugoslav partisans, Greek resistance fighters, Soviet forces, French colonial units, even Israeli defense forces. Your weapon didn't stay loyal to any particular cause." Weber studied the images, feeling the familiar weight of the engineer's burden settling across his shoulders. In one photograph, he could see a young soldier. He might have been German or American or British. The image was too grainy to tell, cleaning the weapon with the kind of careful attention that suggested both professional competence and personal affection. "What is it you want me to say, Dr. Hoffmann?" Weber asked. "That I regret the work? That I wish we'd never developed the MG42? Or are you hoping I'll claim some kind of moral superiority because I'm now building weapons for NATO instead of the Wehrmacht?" She leaned back in her chair, considering him with the analytical gaze he'd learned to associate with academics and investigators. "I'm interested in how you reconcile the continuity between your past work and your present work. The MG3 shares most of its mechanical DNA with the MG42. Are you transforming something evil, or are you just giving evil a new uniform?" The question hit harder than Weber had expected. It was one thing to wrestle with such doubts privately in the workshop's quiet hours, but hearing them articulated so directly forced him to confront assumptions he'd been carefully avoiding. "Dr. Hoffmann," he said slowly, "I think you're asking the wrong question. Evil isn't a property of machinery. It's a property of intention and application. The same hammer that builds a house can crush a skull. The same fire that warms a home can burn it down. The moral weight doesn't lie in the tool. It lies in the hand that holds it and the purpose it serves. But some tools are designed specifically for destruction," she countered. A machine gun has no civilian application. Its only purpose is to kill human beings efficiently. How do you separate that function from moral judgment? Weber was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the young soldier in Gruner's photograph, about Maria's letters from Bavaria, about the workers in his facility who approached their tasks with pride and precision. Because, Doctor, sometimes the capacity for destruction serves the cause of protection. The MG3 is designed to defend democratic institutions against totalitarian aggression. The same mechanism that once served conquest now serves resistance to conquest. If there's redemption in that transformation, it lies not in denying the weapon's lethal purpose, but in ensuring that purpose serves justice rather than oppression. Dr. Hoffman gathered her photographs, but Weber sensed the conversation wasn't over. "Mr. Weber, may I ask you something personal?" He nodded. "Do you sleep well?" The question surprised him with its directness. Weber considered lying, offering the kind of professional reassurance that engineers were trained to project. Instead, he found himself answering honestly, "Some nights better than others, Doctor. But I've learned that the alternative to wrestling with these questions isn't peace, it's indifference. And indifference is how good people end up serving evil causes without meaning to." After Dr. Hoffman left, Weber found himself walking through the workshop with different eyes. The workers hunched over their machines, the careful precision of the assembly process, the quality control inspections, all of it suddenly seemed both noble and terrible, the daily routine of people creating instruments of death with the hope of serving life. Miller approached him near the end of the shift, carrying a batch of test reports that showed the MG3 performing flawlessly under extreme conditions. "Herr Weber, the tests from the Arctic simulation came back perfect. And the desert trials are showing even better reliability than we projected." Weber nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The weapon's impact would extend far beyond German borders. Over the coming decades, the MG3 would be adopted by dozens of countries, from Turkey to Pakistan, from Portugal to Iran. Its reliability in desert conditions, mountain warfare, and jungle operations would make it a preferred choice for armies facing diverse threats. But Weber was beginning to understand that success for a weapons designer was a more complicated achievement than he'd realized. Every improvement in reliability meant the weapon would serve longer. Every enhancement in effectiveness meant it would be more sought after. The engineer's paradox was that technical excellence multiplied moral complexity rather than resolving it. That evening he wrote a long letter to Maria, trying to explain the weight he carried and the hope he still maintained. "I believe," he wrote, "that we can transform the tools of yesterday's aggression into instruments of tomorrow's defense. But belief isn't certainty, and the engineer's burden is to act on hope while acknowledging doubt." As winter approached Düsseldorf, Weber continued his work with a new awareness of its implications. The MG3 was no longer just a technical achievement or a NATO requirement. It was becoming a test of whether human intention could truly transform human creation. What haunts you more? What you've built or what you've failed to build? The spring of 1960 brought unexpected visitors to the Rheinmetall facility. Weber was reviewing production schedules when Colonel Dietrich entered the workshop accompanied by a group of men whose bearing suggested military experience, though they wore civilian clothes. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, introduced himself simply as Major General Harrison, retired U.S. Army. "Mr. Weber," Harrison said in accented but competent German, "we'd like to discuss the global implications of your weapon." What followed was a conversation that would reshape Weber's understanding of what he'd accomplished. Harrison's group represented a NATO working committee on weapons standardization, but their concerns went beyond technical specifications. They were tracking how the MG3's success was influencing military doctrine across the alliance and beyond. "Your weapon is being requested by 37 countries," Harrison explained, spreading a world map across Weber's workbench. Red pins marked nations that had already placed orders. Blue pins indicated those in negotiation. From Arctic conditions in Norway to jungle warfare in Southeast Asia, the MG3 is becoming the standard for defensive operations. Weber studied the map, feeling a mixture of pride and apprehension. The engineering principles he'd refined were influencing machine gun design across continents, proving that innovation could transcend its original context. But each pin also represented thousands of weapons that would bear his mechanical fingerprints, serving causes he might never understand in conflicts he couldn't predict. "General," Weber said carefully, "I designed the MG3 to serve NATO's defensive requirements. What happens beyond that?" "Isn't that beyond my control?" Harrison's expression grew serious. "Mr. Weber, I want to show you something that might change your perspective." He opened a briefcase and withdrew a folder marked "Classified, NATO Eyes Only." Inside were field reports from various theaters where early MG3 units had been deployed. Weber read with growing amazement as commanders described the weapon's performance not just in terms of firepower, but in terms of its psychological effect on defensive operations. "Look at this report from Berlin," Harrison said, pointing to a particular document. "Border guards report that the MG3's presence has actually decreased tensions along the wall. Soviet probes have become less frequent and less aggressive since these positions were upgraded." Weber continued reading, finding similar reports from other flashpoint locations. The weapon's reputation for reliability and accuracy was serving as a deterrent, creating stability through demonstrated defensive capability rather than through offensive threat. "You see, Mr. Weber," Harrison continued, "what you've created isn't just a better machine gun. You've created a diplomatic instrument. The MG3's philosophical emphasis on defense over offense is changing how military planners think about deterrence." But the most significant revelation came in a report from an unexpected source. Dr. Hoffman, the researcher from Munich, had continued her investigation into the moral dimensions of weapons development and had uncovered something remarkable in Soviet military archives that had recently become available through intelligence channels. "Read this," Harrison said, handing Weber a translated document. "It's from a Red Army analysis of NATO defensive capabilities, written last month." Weber read with growing astonishment. The Soviet report described the MG3 not as a threat to be overcome, but as evidence of NATO's genuinely defensive intentions. Where the MG42 had been analyzed in terms of its offensive potential, the MG3 was being evaluated as proof that Western forces were preparing to hold territory rather than seize it. "They see the same philosophical transformation that you intended," Harrison explained. "The engineering changes you made actually communicate political intentions. Your weapon is serving as a diplomatic signal as much as a military asset." For Weber, this revelation recontextualized everything he'd struggled with over the past 2 years. The transformation he'd attempted wasn't just mechanical or moral, it was strategic and political. The MG3 represented not just German engineering redemption, but Western civilizational values, the principle that strength could serve defense without threatening aggression. But the conversation took an unexpected turn when Harrison revealed the real reason for their visit. "Mr. Weber, we want to commission a comprehensive study of the engineering principles behind the MG3's success, not for replication, but for application to other weapon systems. The philosophical framework you've developed, optimizing for defense rather than offense, could revolutionize military engineering." Weber was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. To share the MG3's design principles would accelerate the weapon's global influence, but it would also dilute his control over how those principles were applied. The engineer's dilemma was whether to trust the world with his innovation or to limit its spread by restricting its understanding. "General," Weber said finally, "if I agree to this, how do you ensure the principles are applied ethically?" Harrison's answer surprised him with its honesty. "We don't, Mr. Weber. We can't. Once knowledge enters the world, it belongs to the world. The best we can do is hope that the values embedded in the knowledge are strong enough to guide its application." That evening, Weber found himself alone in the workshop with the original MG42 components that had started his journey 2 years earlier. The weapon that had once symbolized aggression and terror now seemed like an artifact from a different civilization, not just a different nation, but a different understanding of what engineering could accomplish. He thought about Werner Gruner, who had died carrying the weight of unintended consequences. Weber was beginning to understand that the engineer's burden wasn't to avoid such consequences, but to ensure that the values guiding creation were strong enough to influence application, even when the creator no longer had control. The MG3 had become more than a successful weapons project. It represented the possibility of technological redemption, the idea that human innovation could learn from its mistakes and evolve toward more ethical applications. But redemption, Weber was learning, was not a destination, but a process, requiring constant vigilance and moral courage. Outside, Düsseldorf settled into its nighttime rhythm, the sounds of reconstruction replaced by the quieter activities of a city at peace. Weber continued working by lamplight, not because he had to, but because the work itself had become a form of meditation, a way of wrestling with questions that had no final answers, but demanded constant engagement. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new requests for the MG3's global deployment, new opportunities to see whether engineering conscience could truly influence engineering application. But tonight, surrounded by the tools and blueprints of his redemptive effort, Weber allowed himself to believe that transformation was possible, not just for weapons, but for the civilization that created them. If the same hands that build can also destroy, what determines which purpose they serve? Weber continued working at Rheinmetall until his retirement in 1984, overseeing continuous improvements to the MG3 system. 25 years after that first morning, when he'd stared at the disassembled MG42 like a skeleton of prehistoric ambition, the weapon had evolved into something he could never have imagined. The MG3 had been adopted by armies across 6 continents, serving in conflicts and peacekeeping operations that spanned the globe's ideological and geographical divisions. But Weber rarely spoke publicly about his work, preferring to let the weapon's performance speak for itself. He gave occasional interviews to technical journals and military historians, but he deflected questions about the moral dimensions of his engineering choices. That burden, he'd learned, was his to carry privately. In private moments, usually in his small office overlooking the Düsseldorf facility's main production floor, Weber would run his hands along the gun's contours, feeling the intersection of past trauma and future possibility. The metal was warm from recent manufacturing, carrying the heat of human creation and mechanical precision. The letters from home had continued throughout his career. Maria's correspondence evolved from concern to pride to a kind of weary acceptance of her husband's complicated relationship with his work. After she died in 1981, Weber found himself even more isolated with the questions that had defined his professional life. Klaus, his son Hans, had said during one of their infrequent conversations, "Why didn't you ever become a civil engineer? Why weapons?" The question haunted Weber because he'd never found a satisfactory answer, even for himself. The path from teenage apprentice to weapons designer to NATO engineer hadn't been chosen so much as encountered, each decision seeming logical in the moment, but adding up to a career he couldn't have planned or predicted. But perhaps the most significant validation of Weber's work came from an unexpected source. In 1982, Dr. Hoffmann, now a professor at Munich and recognized authority on post-war German technology, published a comprehensive study of the MG3's influence on international military doctrine. Her conclusion challenged both critics and supporters of weapons development. The MG3, she wrote, represents a unique case study in the moral dimensions of engineering. Unlike its predecessor, which was optimized for offensive operations and psychological terror, the MG3 embeds defensive priorities into its mechanical design. This transformation demonstrates that engineering choices themselves can carry moral weight and diplomatic significance. Weber read her study with fascination, recognizing his own choices analyzed through academic frameworks he'd never considered. Hoffman had tracked the weapon's deployment across dozens of conflicts and found that forces equipped with MG3s showed statistically lower rates of civilian casualties and collateral damage than those using other weapon systems. The MG3's emphasis on accuracy over rate of fire and sustainability over shock effect appears to encourage more discriminate use of force, she concluded. The weapon's design philosophy influences tactical behavior in ways that support, rather than undermine, international humanitarian law. But the study also revealed troubling complexities. The MG3's reliability and effectiveness had made it popular with both legitimate military forces and irregular combatants. Weber's attempt to embed defensive values in mechanical design had succeeded, but those values didn't prevent the weapon from being used in causes he would have opposed. The engineer's burden, Weber realized, during his final years at Rheinmetall, was not to control how his innovations were used, but to ensure that they embody the best values possible within their intended function. The MG3 represented the most ethical machine gun he could design, but it remained a machine gun, an instrument optimized for taking human life, however carefully constrained by engineering conscience. His retirement party was a subdued affair, attended by colleagues who understood that they were marking the end of an era in German weapons design. Weber's approach, balancing technical excellence with moral reflection, had influenced a generation of engineers who now led projects across the defense industry. "Klaus," said Dr. Langs, whose grey hair had turned white during their years of collaboration, "what you accomplished with the MG3, it proved that German engineering could serve peace as well as war." Weber appreciated the sentiment, but he wasn't sure he agreed. The MG3 served peace only indirectly, by making defensive operations more effective and by signaling peaceful intentions to potential adversaries. It remained, fundamentally, an instrument of war, however carefully its war-making capacity had been channeled toward defensive purposes. When Weber died in 1997, his obituary barely mentioned the MG3. The few paragraphs devoted to his career focused on his contributions to NATO standardization and his role in rebuilding Germany's engineering reputation. But in military museums across the globe, the weapon stood as testament to the possibility of redemption through innovation. Dr. Hoffman, now in her 70s, attended Weber's funeral in Bavaria. Afterward, she walked through the village where he'd grown up, trying to understand the environment that had shaped his conscience. The church where Father Möller had once preached about rebuilding what we've helped destroy still stood, though both men were gone. In the cemetery behind the church, Weber's grave bore a simple inscription: Klaus Weber, 1925–1997, engineer. But Hoffman knew that the real monument to his work wasn't carved in stone. It was deployed in dozens of countries, serving causes both noble and questionable, carrying within its mechanical design the evidence that human conscience could influence human creation. Years later, when military historians analyzed the Cold War's peaceful conclusion, some would note the role of defensive technologies in reassuring both sides that neither sought aggressive advantage. The MG3's contribution to this stability was difficult to measure precisely, but its presence in NATO arsenals had communicated defensive intentions clearly enough to be recognized even by adversaries. The weapon that had once terrorized Allied soldiers as Hitler's buzzsaw had been transformed into an instrument protecting NATO installations and peacekeeping forces worldwide. But that transformation required more than engineering innovation. It demanded moral courage, the willingness to wrestle with questions that had no perfect answers, while continuing to act on imperfect but carefully considered principles. In the end, Weber's legacy wasn't the machine gun that defined his reputation. It was the man who dared to believe that even the darkest creations could be transformed into tools of protection rather than destruction. The engineer's burden was to carry that hope while acknowledging its limits, to create with conscience while accepting that conscience alone couldn't control creation's ultimate application. The workshop had fallen silent years ago, but somewhere in the world, the rhythmic hammering of metal against metal continued, as new engineers wrestled with the same eternal questions. How do we create responsibly? How do we serve justice without enabling injustice? How do we transform the tools of yesterday's mistakes into instruments of tomorrow's hope? The answers, Weber had learned, weren't found in blueprints or technical specifications. They were forged in the daily choices of people who understood that creation without conscience was mere mechanism, while conscience without creation was merely intention. The intersection of the two, fallible, complicated but essential, was where human progress actually occurred. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What legacy would you choose to leave? What you built or how you built it? Built.